Hello, everyone. Today in this video, I want to tell you about an archaeological discovery that I made a few years ago. And I'd been looking for this for literally decades. It has to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's at the site where we think the community that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls lived. Some people call them Essenes. That's not particularly important for what we're going to cover. But whatever we call them, I like to call them the people of the new covenant or the children of light or the people of the way, because that's what they call themselves. But this discovery, as mundane as it might sound to you when I tell you what it is very, very important. And it sheds so much light on the community and even how to read the scrolls. So, what is it? I think I might have discovered or pinpointed the toilets or latrines that the group used. Now, I know that can sound kind of mundane, like toilets, latrines, but when you're doing archaeology and you have a certain site that you're investigating, two of the things that you might not think of immediately that are so important to try to determine the garbage dump and where did they go to the toilet. But in the case of Qumran, it's got something much more important involved with that question of the latrines, not just where did they go, but why did they pick that spot and how did it work into their understanding of certain observances of the Torah. So before I go into that lecture, I want to share my screen and just mention something a little broader, and that has to do with this Dead Sea Scroll course that I just released last week. It's with Myth Vision podcast courses. I already have one on Mark, which many of you have taken, but this one is called Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let me click on that, and you can see what it looks like. Here's the introduction. This is how the course actually looks if you go into it. And you can see it's very well laid out by Ryan Lambert, who is Derek Lambert's wife and noble assistant. And she's very skilled at this kind of thing. But you get a lot of materials with the course. So yeah, I'm pitching it to you because I think it's really, really good. I put hundreds and hundreds of hours into this. One of the things that you get, I'll show you right here, and we can even hold up a copy of it, although when I share the screen, I become a little postage stamp, is this extensive course guidebook. And here it is. Here's the cover of it. It's a course pack, and it's about 30 pages. You also get about 50 to 75 other pages of PDFs and notes and sources, but this is your guide as you're working through the 10 lessons. And you can see how it's produced. It's really well done. Here are the topics. What are the scrolls? Christianity before Jesus, could you call it that? Community rule, that's an actual text. Who are the Essenes? A couple more scrolls we look at. What about the teacher of righteousness? We've got his picture up, as you saw in that initial thumbnail. What do we learn from the newly published scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, because this group had copies of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, 2,000 years old. So that's 1,000 years older than anything we'd had before, and so forth, all kinds of bonus materials. So let's talk about the toilets at Qumran. I've got slides. You got to have slides for this because it's pretty visual, as you can imagine. So I presented this as a academic paper recently at the International Symposium on Archaeology and the Bible. They didn't allow recording, which I think is fine, but I wanted to reproduce it for you here in terms of what I presented. So I've called it Texts and Sites, the Latrines at Qumran. So what do I mean by texts and sites? Whenever you do archaeology, you go to a site, of course. So there's the settlement of Qumran, where I started looking for the latrines years ago. But then if we have text that might apply to that site, it could give us clues as to how to understand the site, how the site was used, and so forth. But it's kind of a vicious circle in that you want the site to speak for itself, and then you've got the text, but you don't want the text to override the site or the site to override the text. So you want them to be two sources that you use very carefully. And there's a method to that that I tried to cover in my lecture. Now, this actually involves something broader. Whenever you do archaeology as related to the Bible, as any anthropology department will tell you, any good anthropology department where you study archaeology, there's no such thing as biblical archaeology. In other words, it's not well thought of to do the 19th century thing where you take your Bible in one hand, your shovel or your spade in the other, and you go kind of looking around, oh, maybe I'll find this, maybe I'll find that, to quote, prove the Bible. Now, people can have all kinds of motivations, but if you're doing archaeology, you want a scientific motivation. I've done a lot of excavations and people come by and talk. You have fences around sometimes and visitors come when the site's not even open yet for people to tour. But they always yell through the fence, what are you finding? Have you found anything yet? And you know what I tell my students and others that I work with to say? Yes, we've found everything that's here. Meaning, if you start out the first day and there's a modern artifact like a cigarette butt on the ground, guess what? If you're doing archaeology, you record that. All material evidence is part of the story. A simple definition of archaeology is the material evidence of the human past. So we've got this Bible and the spade conundrum. We've got text with no sites, and we've got sites with no text. But sometimes we have sites with text. So the method is to try to figure out how to go about those. I'm not an archaeologist. My PhD is in text. But about 20 years ago, actually 23 years ago to be exact, I began participating in archaeological projects, ended up being involved in over a dozen or so, and have been co-director of 4 or 5 excavations along with a qualified archaeologist. So I was part of the team and of course interested in the archaeology, but also working on the texts. So here's a good illustration of the problem. From 1938 to 1997, there was a magazine published by the American Schools of Oriental Research, which basically it's called ASOR, but Oriental doesn't mean, as it does today to many people, Asia on the globe, but the ancient Near East. So the title today is Near Eastern Archaeology. And by saying archaeology, you don't have to have the word ancient. So in 1998, they changed the title. And the reason is the archaeologists working with and publishing the magazine and doing the work of the American School really did want to make clear that they're doing pure archaeology. And if it relates to the Bible, it relates to the Bible. But that's not why you do it. You do it because what's there is there, and you always want to know the facts about an archaeological site. Now, the founder of biblical archaeologists, I think, was pretty savvy, the famous G.E. Wright. And what he said in the very first issue in 1938 is that there was a need for a readable, non-technical, yet thoroughly reliable account of archaeological discoveries as they are related to the Bible. That's really a great description of what we want to do. I mean, things are related to the Bible, but you don't go treasure hunting. And then we also have a very popular magazine that's published 4 times a year, Biblical Archaeology Review, started in 1975 by the late Herschel Shanks. I knew him well. There's a picture. And this has a very wide circulation. Here's the current issue. And the editor, the current editor, Glenn Corbett, I interviewed recently on YouTube. So if you look at my YouTube channel, James Tabor Videos, go back and listen to that interview. I think you'll find it very interesting. I would say that Glenn, who is an archaeologist, his PhD is from the University of Chicago in ancient Near Eastern studies. My PhD is from the University of Chicago in textual studies, biblical texts, New Testament, Greco-Roman religions, and so forth, ancient Mediterranean religions, we call it. So listen to that, and we do discuss this a little bit. So I want to make clear that in terms of archaeology, I'm with the idea that we do a scientific job. In other words, we really don't do biblical archaeology, but I have no objection to this title because I think it communicates to people what Professor Wright was saying. Academic, reliable accounts of discoveries as they relate to the Bible. There's a great interest in the Bible in our culture. And so there's no reason to think that you should avoid the Bible or anything to do with the Bible. So if you're digging in the Galilee or in Jerusalem, some things are going to have a kind of association or an impact on understanding Jesus or Paul or anything that I work on, or things in the Hebrew Bible the same way. Here's a great aerial shot. It was obviously taken from the air. And you have this wonderful view of the old city of Jerusalem today. And look, you can still see, if you zoom in, you can really see this four-square nature of the old city. And then the Temple Mount, as Jews call it, or the Haram, as the Muslims refer to it, and the Dome of the Rock. This, by the way, is not a mosque. This is the mosque. And this actually is a shrine covering a rock. So it's called the Dome of the Rock. And that'll be another lecture. As you head out of Jerusalem, you get into what's called the Judean wilderness. And you head down to the Dead Sea. And on a clear day from the Mount of Olives, you don't even have to be up in an airplane, you can see the Dead Sea. And these are the hills of Moab behind it. And that's the country of Jordan today. Now, here's the road. You go from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and you get to Qumran. That's where we're headed. This is about 15 to 18 miles because it winds around. Here's Jericho, very famous place. These are all mentioned if you're familiar with the New Testament. They're mentioned all the time in some of our literature. Here's the Dead Sea. Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level. The Dead Sea is 1,200 feet below sea level. This is the lowest spot on planet Earth. There's a bar down here by Qumran at one of the kibbutzes, and they have a label on the bar saying, "Welcome to the lowest bar, B-A-R, on Earth," which is always a lot of fun to have a drink in and think about where you are in the bathtub of planet Earth. Here's another map of the area that gives you a lot more details. Here's Jerusalem up in the highlands and the mountains, and you make your way down around this way and then down to Qumran. And around Qumran is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And this is that wilderness of Judea. Now, one thing I'm going to point out here is that when you begin to read the Dead Sea Scrolls, the very first charter document, we call it the community rule, it begins to talk about preparing the way in the wilderness. So we got the Damascus document and the community rule that begin to fill us in on the ideology and the thoughts of the group. And you know what they say? They say that they're preparing the way in the wilderness. And the word wilderness there is not just any wilderness. It's actually the Arava. It's this Rift Valley of the Jordan River. And you see how the Jordan River is winding down, emptying into the Dead Sea. And there's no outflow at the south end. So that's interesting. Prepare the way. You open up our earliest gospel, which I think is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. And where is John the Baptist? He's out at the River Jordan baptizing. And it says he's quoting when people ask him, what are you doing? I am the voice calling out in the Arava, prepare the way of the Lord. So John the Baptizer is going up and down the Jordan River from north to south, baptizing people. And this group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually situated on the northwest side of the Dead Sea. Now, we're zooming in more here. You can see Qumran. It's called Khirbet, which in Arabic means the ruins of, or the village, what's left of it. And if you count the caves, there are 11 caves altogether. Cave 1, Cave 2, up to the north. This isn't very far. You can see the scale of miles of half a mile. So if you're here at the settlement, you can see up this direction. You can't see the caves because they're hidden away. And then you've got 4, 5, 6, 7 through 10, but then 3 and 11, 3 right after Cave 2, and 11 is the last of all. And that had some very significant scrolls in it. Cave 3 had the copper scroll, if you've heard of that. I cover all of this in the course in great detail. So my purpose here is not to give a survey. Wow, what a picture. Look at this. This is the site of Qumran as it looked a few years ago. You can see a little modern pavement here, which is the parking lot. This area is a lot more extensively developed now as a visitor center because this is such a popular stop for tours of Israel and the Holy Land. But this is what it looks like. Notice there's a perimeter wall still left going around, and here it is here all the way down, and then a drop off into Wadi Qumran, it's called, which is the ravine. And in the winter, water does flow down from Jerusalem all the way down to the Dead Sea. These are some of the caves. I want you to notice here on the northwest side, that is actually a mikveh, or a ritual pool of immersion. And when you would go in and out of this camp, you couldn't go this way, obviously. There was one entrance and exit here, but the main entrance is right here. Okay. Here's a shot that I took in winter, and you can see when the rains come and when the floods come from the highlands, you actually get some greenery here. And this is the assembly hall where the group gathered. We don't know how many lived here, and many of us think that the group is actually living in caves as well as the settlement. But this seems to be a kind of spiritual headquarters for the movement. The historian Josephus, we think, calls this group the Essenes. They apparently don't call themselves that unless it's part of a Hebrew word, osim, Essene, osim in Hebrew, the doers. So they might have used the term, we are the doers of the Torah. That would fit. That's used in the New Testament by Jesus as well as Paul. Don't just be hearers, but be doers of the law or the Torah. But either way, whether you use that name or not, Josephus says the Essenes are spread throughout the country in his day, which would be the 1st century, basically the time around the time of Jesus and his followers and his movement, and that they live outside every village and town. They tend to separate because they have different laws of purity. So here in the desert, this would be what you would call the headquarters. Some people call it a monastery. I think that's Christianizing it a little too much, but they do have communal living. Here, this is actually, I'll show you where it is. You see my cursor. This is the assembly hall. And right here to the left, as we're looking at the picture, is this pantry where there was an assemblage of dishware. Here it's been glued back together. And you can see that it's basically service for the group. Everybody gets the same size plate and bowl and saucer and so forth. And of course, you don't need knives and forks in this culture. And so we think they were assembling in this hall as well as eating in the hall. And that brings up the question, what about the toilets? But before we get to that, here's another schematic drawing of the site. So reorient yourself here, and you've got a scale of miles, and you've got something about north, south, east, west. So to the northwest, that's that ritual pool where you would exit. Then you've got your perimeter wall going around like that. And then this is the settlement with the drop off into the wadi. But look at this. As you go to the east of the site, you've got 1,100 tombs. There's a Norse cemetery. There's some of these wings that go out on outcroppings of the Marl Terrace. 1,100 is a lot. So people were being buried here, I think, just like in Jerusalem. People are buried all along the Mount of Olives and all below the Temple Mount or the Haram area. And it's considered sacred, but death needs to be outside the camp, so to speak, in terms of ritual purification. Okay, this is what the graves look like in the winter. You can see the plants are coming up. It's a pile of rocks. It's actually 6 feet down, and then there's a kind of a slot for the body. And here's the view of the Dead Sea. So it's a very picturesque place to be buried. Now, one of the things I'll point out, and I keep saying in the course, but there's a lot I cover in the course, is that these graves are oriented north and south. So let me go back here. In other words, the head is at the south and the feet are at the north. So if the person rises up, the person is looking north. All kinds of possible reasons for that. The theory that I've found makes the most sense is they believe that their messiahs that they're expecting are going to come from the north. They believe Jerusalem, which is to the east, is corrupt. Now, Jews are normally buried, and these are definitely Jews, they're normally buried so that their feet would be here and their head would be here. And then when they're raised up, they would be looking towards the light of Jerusalem. But this group thinks Jerusalem is corrupt, much like Jesus of Nazareth calls the temple a den of robbers or shredders, literally, shredding their sacrifices, like wolves in a lair or a cave. Not nice language. Anyway, again, all that's covered in the course. Here's a nice picture of what it might have looked like. Here's our pool again. I keep mentioning the pool because you're going to see. And then you've got your wall going around, and here's your cemetery. I love this particular drawing. I think it comes from Hirschfeld, the late Hirschfeld, who was a friend of mine, but he had it made. It's really a great drawing. So you get the idea. There is a tower, and this goes back to the Iron Age. So obviously this group we don't think existed in the Iron Age. And Jody Magnus has written this wonderful introduction to the archaeology of Qumran, where you can read about all the different periods of habitation. But in the 1st century BCE and into the 1st century CE, we believe this religious group was inhabiting the place, maybe made certain modifications for their own purposes, such as this ritual pool of immersion. So as you come in the camp, you immerse yourself, and then you're ritually pure. Here is Father Roland DeVoe, who was the first excavator at Qumran. Want to give him credit. He was a Catholic priest and monk, and it is true that he tended to interpret the site from his own monastic background. I'm not saying that's totally wrong, but Jewish monks might not be quite the same as Christian monks, and so, but living in common, all male community, as far as we know, inside the settlement itself, because Josephus says outside all over that this group, they marry, they have children, and they live a non-celibate life, but inside, during the time at least that they're at the spiritual headquarters, they're living a spiritual life. It might not have been a lifetime thing, we're just not sure. Now, here are the texts that I mentioned in the community rule, talking about those who follow this way separate from the assembly of perverse men, and that includes, to this group, all other Jewish groups. In other words, they're calling, if you're not part of this way of truth, then you're not part of God's final true community. This is apocalyptic, messianic, eschatological community. Some of you follow my series on Bible prophecy. I'm telling you, this group buys into it, and they think they're going to live to see the time of the end. And then they actually quote Isaiah 40, verse 3, which is quoted in the opening of the Gospel of Mark. They say, what are we doing? In the desert, we're preparing the way of the Lord, and we're making straight in the Arava, that's the Hebrew word, the Arava, out by the Dead Sea, a highway for our God. Now, they then interpret this not as road building, but as the law is the way of God. And so they're interpreting the Torah or the law of God correctly and strictly, and they're trying to observe the Torah very strictly. And they believe that mainstream Jews in Jerusalem and all over the country are not being careful enough in their Torah observance. Now, I want to point out, because we're going to talk about ritual purity and the latrines now, that this is not just a Jewish thing. Here's one of my favorite texts: rules for purity for visitors to a temple. But what temple? Well, this is the temple of Athena. And it says, whether you're a resident of the city or anyone else, if you want to go to the temple of Athena, the Greek goddess, you must refrain from intercourse with your wife or husband that day, intercourse with another than his wife or husband for the preceding 2 days. Now, it's not that sex is bad, but it's that can make you ritually impure to go into a temple. The idea of ritual purity is basically blood, sex, and death, these 3 marks of humanity. If you know my teacher, Eliade at Chicago, or Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, the sacred and the profane, purity and danger. These are categories of inside where it's holy and outside where it's ordinary. When you say it's defiled or it's contaminated, it doesn't mean with dirt or anything like that, but it's something you can't bring into the temple. You also have to do the required lustrations. These are washings, just like the practice within Judaism and in the Torah or the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. The same prohibition applies to contact with the dead, delivery of a woman in childbirth, or going to a funeral. So what do? You have to purify yourself. They actually have holy water at the door. So if you've ever wondered where holy water comes from, this is all symbolic, but it means I'm in the ordinary world and then I enter the sanctuary of a temple. And you don't do ordinary things in a temple. And if you have been doing ordinary things, sex, blood, and death, then you separate yourself. Purity means to separate from the ordinary or the profane, and then you go into the sacred. So what we're going to cover with Qumran, remember, is a wide phenomena in the Hellenistic world. It's almost universal. Temples are sacred spaces, right? And you don't just barge into a temple and do anything you want. You remember in the Hebrew Bible, the holy and then the holy of holies, and then the courtyard for the priests and the courtyard for the women and the courtyard for Gentiles, these increasing levels of holiness as you get toward the inside of any temple. So the holy and the ordinary. Now, one of the rules that's quite interesting that is in the book of Deuteronomy, the Hebrew Bible, chapter 23, verse 12. Not only blood, sex, and death, but defecation. Where do you relieve yourself if you're in the holy place? I think it's pretty clear you wouldn't do it in the temple. So you're not going to have public restrooms right there in the inner sanctum of the temple or just around the corner as you go out. The idea is to separate things. But this is back in the time of Moses. It's presented as a camp. So you shall have a place outside the camp and go out to it. And you shall have a trowel with your tools. So you got to carry a trowel. And when you sit down outside to go to the toilet, you shall dig a hole with it and turn back and cover up your excrement, because the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp. And that is the word Yahweh or Jehovah, the sacred name. And he's anthropomorphically passing through the camp to save you and deliver you. Therefore, your camp must be holy, so that he may not see anything indecent among you and turn away from you. Now, there's no idea in the Hebrew Bible that nakedness is defiling or sex is defiling, but you don't bring it into the area of the sacred. So in the time in the wilderness, as it's called in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Deuteronomy presents the whole camp around the tent of meeting or the tabernacle as sacred, and latrines need to be outside the camp because God is not only in the temple, but his presence is with the whole community as they're gathered together. So the camp is kind of a different idea than, say, a temple like in Jerusalem, because it has perimeters around it and different degrees of separation. So the Qumran group thinks of their place as a camp in the wilderness. They're trying to replicate the days of Moses. So here are some of the things that they say. A man may not lay with a woman in the city of the temple, defiling the city of the temple. So not only do you want your toilets outside, but sexuality needs to be outside. Now, in a modern city like Jerusalem, or even in the time of Herod the Great, people are living all around the Temple Mount. And obviously, they don't always go outside to have intercourse or to go to the toilet or to do any ordinary activities. So allowances had to be made. But this group is in the wilderness, and they're thinking of a tent of meeting. And maybe in the future, if they were able to take over the temple in Jerusalem, which they perhaps expected to do when God came back and judged the world and handed things over to them, they might well have had their latrines outside the camp. There is one scholar, Bargil Pixner, who's argued that some of the Essenes lived on Mount Zion, but he has an article called An Essene Quarter in Jerusalem, so you can read his arguments. But in his understanding of that area of Jerusalem, the Essenes living there had latrines outside the wall. They would actually go out of the city to do their business, as we say. Now, the temple scroll is the ideal future. This is like how the temple will be in the future when God comes back, judges the world, and sets up the kingdom of God. And one of the things it says in chapter 46, you must sanctify and reverence my temple, for I dwell in the midst. You are to build them a precinct of latrines. Literally, it's called the place of the hand. Hand is a euphemism for the male organ or just for nakedness. So it's a place where you can unveil yourself with modesty, but it's outside the city. Notice, not just outside the temple. And they will go out there on the northwest of the city. There's our direction, northwest. Roof houses, outhouses with pits inside to which excrement will descend. So these are more permanent structures that they're imagining for the future. But out in the desert where they're camping, they follow this principle that the living space has a perimeter. And on the northwest of the camp, I began thinking they would have had the latrines because they're following this ideal. So what do we have in the war scroll? And this is when they're battling the Romans, whom they call the sons of darkness, the Kittim, in a final battle. And it says that the children of light, that's their group, between all their camps will be this latrine, and it will be 2,000 cubits away. It doesn't say northwest, but I think this northwest idea is echoed by looking at the drawings that we've already looked at, that no shameful nakedness shall be in the environs of all their camps. And finally, in the Damascus document, one may not go about in the field to do his desired activity on the Sabbath. One may not travel outside his city more than 1,000 cubits. So maybe you heard about the Sabbath day's journey. It's mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 1, something being about a Sabbath day's journey from Jerusalem. That's 1,000 cubits. If you go by a cubit being about 18 inches, a foot and a half, you can see it's approximately about half a yard. So this would take you out 500 yards. How would you go to the toilet on the Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset when you can't really leave the camp? Now, here's something Josephus says about the Essenes that seems to fit this question. He admires them, by the way. He goes on and on about them. In the course packet, I give you all of these quotations. Also, there's a book that we study with all the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they avoid spitting in the midst of them or on the right side. Moreover, they are stricter than other Jews in resting from their labors. On the seventh day, they not only get their food ready the day before, that they may not be obliged to kindle a fire on that day. That's one of the rules in the Torah. You can't light a fire on Shabbat. Orthodox Jews follow that today. But they will not remove any vessel out of its place, neither to go aside. That means to carry something out to the toilets. You're not supposed to carry anything like a chamber pot. You can't carry your trowel to go dig the hole because it's beyond the 1,000 cubits. So then he goes on to explain, well, what do they do? Well, on other days, okay, so Sunday through Friday sunset, you dig a small pit a foot deep with this paddle. It's kind of a hatchet or a trowel, and you cover yourself around with the garment. You know, you don't pull it up where everybody could see your rear end, and you ease yourselves into that pit, and then you cover it over with earth. And you do this in lonely places. So you could be traveling about and camping, but you would go outside your living area. But at the settlement, you would have a more permanent place, was my theory. So I began looking for these latrines. And although this easement of the body is natural, so it's not dirty or anything like that, it's a rule that you would separate it from the holy, from the camp. And then you wash yourself afterwards, which is done in many cultures. It's not a bad idea. I think you would agree. So Greco-Roman toilets, we know a lot about, lots of articles about the Greco-Roman civilization. If you ever go on any of my tours, I take you to some of these Greco-Roman toilets, and you can even try sitting on one if you like. But they're public, and they're the opposite of this group. This group, you go alone, you keep to yourself, you don't bear your nakedness before other people. So here's our settlement again. And what I began to wonder is what's to the northwest? And I could see it, but for years I would go to Qumran, I would work. I've been there dozens and dozens and dozens of times, sometimes excavating, sometimes surveying, radar ground scan, drilling probes, different things that I've been involved in over the years. But I started thinking more and more about this. So here's the settlement again. Once again, you've got the mikveh. So here's what it looks like. It's been restored quite a bit here, replastered, but it's in fairly good shape after 2,000 years. So this right here, we think you would go down these steps to be cleansed and then back up out of these steps. We're not exactly sure, but one is defiled, the other is clean. And then you can go into the living space. And if you have to go to the toilet some other time, back out again. And here it is to the left. And I took this when it was still green. This was December years ago, right during the winter. And notice this, look at this. I started looking at this. There's a pathway here, which would be natural. So you walk out and you walk to the northwest, and all of a sudden you can be hidden from view of the camp. So I began to investigate this, and I would go look at it and walk around and so forth. And I did notice at one point these cubicles, 2 meters by 2 meters and 1 meter, which is pretty small. And they were just sort of barely into the ground. I actually drew the rocks here very accurately. The question is, I didn't dig. I didn't have a permit to dig. I wasn't intending to dig. But this is behind that rock formation that I just showed you. So the camp is just over the bluff there. It's a perfect site for the latrines. So I began to talk to my friend and colleague Josias, and he came up with the idea, well, let's take some soil samples. And we'll go down about a foot, just like Josephus mentions. And we began to do that. This is one of the excavations. I just put this in to honor Magen Broshi, who's now passed away. who was the last person at Qumran that I excavated with, as well as Hanan Eshel, who's now passed away as well of cancer, unfortunately, too early. And James Charlesworth, you might know James Charlesworth. Here's a younger James Charlesworth, and we're out at Qumran excavating some of the caves just to the north of the site. Very interesting, but that should be another lecture. So what did we do? Here we are. You can see down below here. You can see the grass. And we began to take these samples. This was found in the ruins of Qumran. Whether that's the kind of hatchet that they had, we can't be sure. But it does say in Josephus, among your tools, you should have this. Maybe they just had something like a modern trowel. But we took these samples at various depths. And then we also did control samples. So orient yourself here. You might have to zoom in. This is the settlement right here. And now we're looking to the north. There's that mikvah. And as you can see, if you walk out up here, you come to that bluff right there. So this is where I think the latrines were. This was the hypothesis that we wanted to test. And then, so we call that area A. These are our terms. Area B is a whole broad area that potentially you could go. So B1, B2, still inside of the camp, and even closer B3. We know it's not going to be at the cemetery, which is right here. It can't be south because this is still in the camp. And it wouldn't be out here by the road or by the Dead Sea. So this is basically the area, but this had the most possibility in terms of being hidden from view. So you see, it's a theory. It's a hypothesis that we tested. And what we found, I'm calling the high cost of holiness because it was quite surprising, are these microorganisms that are characteristic of human defecation, but also, among other things, tapeworms. And so you have some parasites here. So if you are infected with these tapeworms, they can get into the various tracts of your body and lay eggs and spread, and it can be quite a serious thing unless you have modern medical care. But notice they're also coming back in and dipping in the mikvah, not really to scrub down, but ritual holiness. But you've got to put your head under. And so if you have open sandals with any cuts and you've been walking in this area, I remember Josias called that whole area a toxic waste dump because you probably had over 100 years of people using that area for their defecation. And so you're going to get water, all the orifices of your face, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the ears, and you're dipping down. And if others were infected, you could see how this would spread. Now, Zayas has presented the idea, and he's the one who would know more about it, that maybe the reason 6% of adult males at Qumran, based on the skeletons that have been sampled at the cemetery, they only live to age 40. Jericho's just to the north. That would be the best comparison because it's the same environment out by the Dead Sea. And you've got almost 50% living to age 40, and then various other percentages Bedouin today, and that's making a modern comparison. Ein Gedi is kind of low, but still, this is really low. Now, in antiquity, you often hear that everybody died at 40 and you were old at that time. That's not the case. If you made it past adolescence, you had a good chance of living to 40, 50, 60, 70 even. We know that from many, many examples, tomb remains and other things. But when you figure in the very high infant and youth mortality rate, it brings the average way, way down. So this is actually the percent of males that were adult who made it past that. So then when you say it's only 6%, something's going on. So here's some resources. I published this article in the French journal Revue de Qumran, and that's a very official article with Josias and another researcher. And here you can get this article. You can actually read my blog post, and you can get this article and then the online course that I've talked about and different other publications. So I think you got the main point. I don't need to give an elaborate summary, but I found this to be a very, very interesting possibility. I don't think it's proven. We weren't able to date that material. I think that could be done in the future because there's always the possibility that many people in the area were using that area over the years for latrines, just passing in the desert or something like that. But, even the Bedouin, from the research that we did, at least, Josias knows the most about this, they don't bury their waste. They don't bury their excrement. They want it to desiccate and dry up so that it will just disappear. It's very dry in the desert, as you might imagine. So I think we have to remain open, and I wouldn't say that this has been proven, but there does seem to be some real strong connections northwest of the camp, beyond 1,000 cubits, not in the living area, hidden from the side of the camp. And you got to say the people were living there, and we think they're the people who wrote the scrolls. So I think it's highly likely. But I don't think it proves anything absolutely. And actually, I hope to revisit this in the future. COVID has stopped a lot of things and some of the political tensions in the area. But there's a lot more to do at Qumran. And I hope in the future, even more scrolls are found. Who knows? On both sides of the Dead Sea, there are always possibilities. So take care, everyone. I'm putting the description of the course in the bottom and along the bottom of the screen. And I hope you'll sign up for the course. I didn't do this video just to promote the course because I just gave this paper last week at the conference. But boy, does it fit the course. And you're really going to delve in if you like this kind of thing. See you next time.